A man once lived inside the Wells house, long before the day a little girl vanished without a trace. When the FBI finally reached him, his first words weren't about shock or disbelief. He simply asked,
Did she get out of the house again?
"Did she get out of the house again?" Those 8 words reopened the case. Because if Summer Wells had escaped before, the story her parents told was never true. Now, buried details are surfacing: an unlocked basement door, a blue couch hiding something it shouldn't, a fridge used as a hiding place, and a shower no one wants to talk about. 10 pieces that never fit, until now. This isn't a story about a missing child. It's a reconstruction of every lie that kept her from being found.
Oh, first, I'm going to tell you, the first thing I told the FBI was, did she get out of the house again? That was the first line that came out of my mouth.
When federal agents finally located Jose Roman, they expected surprise, shock, disbelief, something that sounded like a normal reaction to a child's disappearance. Instead, he simply asked one question: did she get out of the house again? That single line was not confusion. It was recognition. The word, again, wasn't rhetorical, it was memory. Jose had already seen Summer Wells slip out of that house before. To him, the idea that she might have wandered off once more wasn't impossible, it was predictable. But for investigators, that one word, again, detonated the official narrative that her parents had built and repeated for years. She never wandered off. Jose lived inside that house for months. He saw which doors were locked and which weren't. He described a child who knew how to turn a handle, twist a latch, and step into the open yard without anyone noticing. He said the front door only had a small knob lock, no deadbolt. The basement door didn't lock at all. A blue couch was pushed against it to keep it closed. That's what he told former homicide detective Chris McDonough. According to Jose, Summer knew how to bypass both. She didn't need help. She had done it before. This directly contradicts everything Don and Candace Wells have ever said publicly. Their version depends on a single assumption: that Summer was safe inside the home when she vanished. They told police, reporters, and their own neighbors that she would never go far, that she was afraid of the woods, that she only played near her swing or garden. Every interview, every plea to the public reinforced that point. Summer could not have left on her own. That is the core of their abduction story. But Jose's first question to the FBI rewrote that entire framework. If the little girl had indeed gotten out again, then the abduction theory collapses instantly. The danger wasn't a stranger climbing a hill. The danger was a 4-year-old who had freedom, opportunity, and no supervision. When investigators reconstruct a disappearance, they look for recurring behaviors, patterns that might predict how the child acted that day. If Jose's account is true, then Summer's wandering wasn't a random event. It was a known behavior that adults around her had acknowledged and ignored. Jose said he wasn't the only one who noticed. Summer's grandmother and family friend Allie had both warned Candace about it. "We all told her," Jose recalled. "You need to watch her more closely." According to him, Candace brushed it off every time. "She's fine," she would say. "She doesn't go far." That simple dismissal now reads like the earliest layer of denial, the first brick in a wall that would later become the family's entire defense. When people lie to authorities, they rarely invent a whole story from nothing. They start by removing the small truths that make them look negligent. Candace didn't have to invent an abduction to hide what happened. She just had to erase the fact that her daughter could open a door. For the FBI, Jose's question would have carried enormous evidentiary weight. In an interview, the order of statements matters. Unprompted remarks, things a witness says before being asked, are considered spontaneous admissions. They reflect authentic knowledge. Jose didn't ask, "What happened?" He asked, "Did she get out again?" That assumes prior incidents. It implies that, in his experience, Summer leaving the house was normal, not shocking. If that's accurate, and if Dawn and Candace later denied it, they didn't just misremember, they lied to federal agents. That is obstruction, not confusion. When you tell investigators your child would never wander, knowing she already had, you are shaping the case to fit a false conclusion. And in missing child investigations, The moment parents become unreliable narrators, every part of their story becomes evidence against them. The critical question then becomes, when was the last time anyone other than Candace or Dawn saw Summer outside, alive and unharmed? According to the timeline, there's no independent record after the grocery trip video on June 15. No neighbors saw her. No surveillance footage captured her. No witness reported a sighting that day. But if Jose's description is accurate, if she had a habit of slipping out, there should have been prior reports, at least informal mentions from locals who saw a small child near the property. None exist. That absence raises two possibilities. Either Jose exaggerated her independence, or the community had normalized seeing her alone so completely that it didn't seem unusual until she vanished. In both cases, the result is the same: a child whose freedom was underestimated and whose parents refused to admit how little control they truly had. Candace's later behavior reinforces that fear of exposure. During interviews, she always speaks in absolutes. She would never do that. She's afraid of the dark. She never leaves the yard. Absolute language is a red flag for investigators. Real memory allows for uncertainty. Denial needs certainty. The more someone insists, never, the less investigators believe them. And in this case, never has already been proven false by a man who had no reason to lie. The psychology behind such denial is consistent. When a child disappears, the line between negligence and criminal liability is razor thin. Admitting that Summer had a history of getting out would have made Candace and Dawn responsible for creating the conditions of her disappearance. In their minds, that confession might as well have been guilt. It's easier to invent an abductor than to face the truth that you left a door open. There's also the question of what changed afterward. According to Jose, when he lived there was no deadbolt on the basement door. After the disappearance, there was. Why would a family secure a door that their daughter had supposedly never used? The answer is as uncomfortable as it is obvious. They were reconstructing the scene to match their version of events. They weren't locking out intruders. They were locking in a narrative. This single contradiction, Jose's, again, versus the Wells, never, is the axis around which every other inconsistency in the case turns. The new locks, the rearranged furniture, the edited timelines all stem from that initial lie. If the house had never been secure, then Summer's exit required no accomplice and no forced entry. It required only opportunity and inattention. And that possibility threatens everything the parents have claimed. It shifts the investigation from a search for a stranger to an examination of a family's failures. It transforms the Wells from victims of circumstance into potential architects of concealment. The FBI understood that instantly. A witness who lived inside the house saying, "She got out before," doesn't solve the case, but it changes its category, from abduction to negligence, from mystery to human error. When Jose asked his question, he probably didn't realize what it meant. He wasn't trying to accuse anyone. He was recalling a memory, a barefoot child running through grass, laughing, as the adults shouted her name. But to investigators, that memory is the first domino. Because if Summer Wells had gotten out before, then every word that followed, every interview, every plea, every story, was built on a lie meant to hide a truth too simple, too painful, and too close to home. In that light, Jose's question is no longer curiosity. It's indictment. Did she get out again? Everything about this case depends on whether the answer is yes. When Jose Roman described the basement of the Wells house, he talked about a door and a couch. A single, heavy blue couch that sat against the inside of the basement entrance, not as decoration but as a barricade. He said the door didn't lock. There was no deadbolt, no latch. The only thing keeping it closed was the weight of that couch pushed tight against it. That detail might seem trivial until you compare it to the photos and interviews that surfaced after Summer vanished. The same door, the same basement, now featuring a solid metal deadbolt, newly installed. In Don Wells' own words to investigators and YouTubers alike, that door was always locked. Two versions of the same door. Two statements that cannot coexist. Jose's testimony describes an open access point, a back road to the yard, easily reachable by a child who knew how to use it. Doan's statement describes a fortress, a home protected from intruders. One man recalls reality as it was. The other rebuilds it as it needed to be. The difference between those two images isn't just a matter of memory. It's a matter of evidence. Because in a disappearance where no one saw Summer leave, the architecture of the house becomes a witness of its own. When Jose lived there, the basement wasn't the forbidden dungeon that the public would later imagine. It was part of daily life. His sleeping space was just beyond that same door. He said the lock didn't exist, and he knew every inch of that layout. The only barrier was the couch, a piece of furniture with more investigative importance than most people realize. In behavioral forensics, physical objects often tell the truth people won't. The position of a chair, the angle of a curtain, a nail newly hammered into a wall, each change captures intent, and nothing says intent to rewrite more than adding a deadbolt after a child disappears. Why lock a door that supposedly was always locked? Why secure an entry point only after the person who used it is gone? If the Wells version were true, that Summer was abducted by an outsider, the deadbolt would be irrelevant. You can't retroactively protect against a kidnapping that already happened. The addition makes sense only under one logic, to match a story being told to law enforcement. When Chris McDonough revisited the property, he noticed it immediately. The placement of the new lock was fresh, the metal gleaming against old, weathered wood. It wasn't there in the photographs taken months earlier. It had been installed after Summer vanished. That simple mechanical change created a legal wall between the family and responsibility. The Wells could now point to that bolt and say, "See, no way she got out." But Jose's recollection dismantles that claim. He remembered the daily rhythm of that house. Candace upstairs at the kitchen table, the kids running around, the smell of cigarettes and cheap liquor in the air. He remembered Summer coming down the stairs to visit him, slipping through the basement room to play near the couch. He remembered the dogs barking outside and how sunlight filtered through the untinted basement windows. If there had been a lock, he would have known. His bed was a few steps away. The sound of a door clicking shut would have been the sound of his sleep. Instead, he remembers the thud of the couch being pushed back and forth. That was the lock. He said, it always stayed there. They kept the couch in front because the door didn't really close right. That couch wasn't furniture. It was a lie waiting to be formalized. And that is exactly what happened. Once the official story took shape, that Summer was taken from the basement. The door had to evolve from an unsecured exit into a sealed entry. The family couldn't afford an unlocked past when their future defense depended on security. It's not unusual for suspects or even panicked parents to modify a scene after an incident. It's called retrospective staging. In missing person cases, it usually appears as safety improvement. Installing cameras, fixing fences, adding lights, all after the fact. The psychology is transparent. They are not protecting anyone new. They are protecting themselves from blame. The Wells basement door fits that exact pattern. When Don later claimed, it was always locked, he wasn't misremembering. He was rewriting. A deadbolt doesn't just secure a door, it secures a timeline. Investigators rely on scene integrity to reconstruct movement. Every door, window, and lock helps define possible routes of escape or entry. When those elements are altered, reconstruction collapses. Jose's version shows a home porous and chaotic, a place a child could exit without resistance. Don's revised version presents a sealed, controlled environment. Only one can align with reality. The contradiction didn't just create confusion for detectives, it redirected the entire investigation. If the door was always locked, the search focus had to move outward, into the woods, the roads, the idea of a stranger. But if the door was open, the focus should have stayed inside, in the space between negligence and cover-up. One false lock diverted thousands of hours of manpower. That's the practical damage. The deeper damage is psychological. The addition of that deadbolt was a symbolic act of guilt management. Candace and Don didn't just need to convince investigators, they needed to convince themselves. Installing a lock after the disappearance let them pretend they'd always done their part. That safety had been there, even if only in hindsight. It turned a visible mistake into a physical correction. But no amount of metal can seal the inconsistency between the two witnesses. Don claimed the basement was off limits. Jose said the children played there daily. Don said the house was secure. Jose said anyone could walk in. Don said the door was locked. Jose said it never was. Those aren't memory lapses. Those are parallel realities, one lived, one performed. And this difference has a direct consequence on how investigators interpret movement. If the basement door was open, Summer's most logical path was outward, through that space and into the yard. If it was locked, she had to vanish within the walls, an impossibility without human help. The Wells' insistence on the latter keeps them shielded from negligence. The truth of the former would expose them to it. That is why the couch mattered. It was plausible deniability made of fabric and wood. We didn't leave the door open, they could claim. It was blocked. Blocking is not the same as locking, but it sounds close enough for comfort. Jose's words strip away that illusion. He saw the door. He used it. He slept beside it. When he told federal agents, there was no lock, only that couch. He reintroduced chaos into a story that had been carefully arranged to appear orderly. It's also worth noting how that modification reshaped public perception. When videos of Dawn showing the basement surfaced, the gleam of the new deadbolt was visible, a quiet signal that the home had been secured. Viewers took it as proof of caution. In reality, it was proof of reconstruction. By the time the public saw the basement, it had already been rewritten into myth. A locked door, a mystery intruder, a story polished for sympathy. But the real house, the one Jose remembered, told a different story, a flimsy frame, loose handles, children running freely between rooms, a couch propped against an unreliable door. A place where a small girl could slip into sunlight before anyone noticed. And that's why the deadbolt matters. It's not a trivial upgrade. It's a timestamp. It marks the moment the Wells family began to edit reality. It was never about safety. It was about alignment, making the physical space match the lie they needed to tell. Locks are supposed to keep danger out. This one was installed to keep the truth from getting in. When Jose Roman told investigators that Summer once hid inside an old refrigerator, it didn't sound like an exaggeration. It sounded like a memory that had stayed with him because it was wrong, because it made him uneasy in a way that only hindsight can explain. He said the moment felt strange, even before the world knew her name. He had been sitting outside near the grandmother's camper, smoking a cigarette, when the boys came running and asked if he'd seen Summer. They were playing hide and seek. She was really good at it, they said. At first, Jose thought she was somewhere behind the trees. He stood up, scanning the yard. And as the boys began to check the shed, something caught his eye, a small movement in the corner near the old refrigerator. He saw the door crack open just an inch and a small face peek out. Then the door shut again. "She's in there," he said, walking over. When he opened the door, Summer burst out laughing. The boys groaned. "You found her. She hides there all the time." That single sentence changed everything. According to Jose, this wasn't an isolated game. It was routine. A 4-year-old climbing into a discarded appliance while her brothers counted, pretending not to breathe, waiting for someone to find her. And Candace, when told about it, didn't seem alarmed. "She's fine," she said. "That fridge doesn't lock." The simplicity of that answer, and the indifference behind it, is what now makes this detail so disturbing. Refrigerators, especially older models, are built with airtight seals. Even with the latch removed, the door can wedge tight enough to cut airflow completely. In accident investigations, appliance entrapment is a known hazard. It doesn't take long. Within 3 to 5 minutes, the carbon dioxide inside rises, oxygen plummets, and a child can lose consciousness without making a sound. For decades, safety campaigns have warned parents never to leave unused fridges outside. Yet at the Wells property, an old refrigerator sat within steps of the camper, rusted, upright, and apparently part of a children's game. If Jose's account is true, that refrigerator isn't just background detail. It is a potential crime scene that vanished before anyone thought to photograph it. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation never mentioned a refrigerator in their public statements. Search warrants listed vehicles, outbuildings, electronic devices, but no appliance. In a disappearance where every square foot of property was supposed to be examined, something as large as a fridge should have appeared in at least one inventory log. It didn't. That absence is telling. Either it was removed before law enforcement arrived, or it was dismissed as irrelevant. Both possibilities lead to questions that no one has answered. Where is that refrigerator now? Who moved it? And when? The timing matters. If it was gone before investigators arrived, someone made a decision to clean, to hide, or simply to erase what they didn't want to explain. In criminal staging, that's known as object displacement. The motive isn't always sinister. Sometimes it's panic. A parent sees something terrible, acts impulsively, and then overcorrects by altering the scene to make it look accidental, or to make it disappear entirely. The Wells property showed other signs of hurried change after June 15. Objects shifted, doors modified, bedding replaced. The refrigerator's absence fits perfectly into that pattern. What makes this detail so critical is its proximity to a plausible timeline. If Summer had a history of hiding in that appliance, and if on the day she vanished she tried to play the same game while no one was watching, the result could have been fatal within minutes. A silent accident. No screams, no abduction, no struggle, just a door closing on air. It would also explain Candace's early contradictions, the confusion about what time she last saw Summer, the strange calmness during initial interviews, the defensive statements like, "I just turned around and she was gone." That phrasing, abrupt disappearance, no sound, matches scenarios of entrapment far more than those of abduction. But admitting that would mean admitting negligence so severe it borders on criminal. It would mean acknowledging that an avoidable hazard on their property killed their child. That kind of truth is almost impossible for parents already under scrutiny by Child Protective Services. The easier path is denial and reconstruction. Move the fridge, close the gap, tell the world she was taken. When Jose described the scene to Chris McDonough, he didn't use the language of accusation. He sounded almost apologetic. "She was laughing," he said. "The boys said she hid there before. Candace told me not to worry, that she checked the fridge already." He paused when he remembered saying it to the FBI later. "I just asked them, could that be what happened?" To investigators, that suggestion should have triggered an immediate forensic follow-up, confirm the appliance's existence, locate it, and test for prints or biological residue. Even a small child leaves trace oils on metal and rubber. If removed, the item could still have been traced through waste management or recycling logs. Yet no such search was ever publicly confirmed. The omission might not be intentional. Agencies often withhold specific findings to protect an open case. But as months passed and the focus shifted to theories of kidnapping and trafficking, the mundane possibilities, suffocation, accident, misadventure, faded from conversation. The fridge story survived only in Jose's recollection, dismissed by some online as irrelevant, too ordinary to explain something so tragic. Ordinary accidents, however, are what most missing child cases eventually turn out to be. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission reports multiple child fatalities every year from discarded appliances. The pattern is almost identical each time. Children playing hide and seek, parents nearby but distracted, discovery only after it's too late. The difference in the Wells case is that the potential hazard was known. Adults saw it. They even joked about it. "She's fine," Candace said. Those words, harmless in the moment, could carry the weight of fatal omission if that game ever turned real. If the fridge was indeed removed after June 15, its disappearance may have been the first act of concealment. Moving it would take at least 2 adults. The yard was open, the soil soft, any drag marks or tire tracks would have been visible for days. None were reported, perhaps because searchers focused uphill, not beside the camper. The early hours of the investigation were chaotic. Hundreds of volunteers trampled the area. A refrigerator could have been quietly loaded onto a truck and hauled away without anyone connecting it to the missing child. There's another unsettling possibility, that the refrigerator was still there during the initial search, and investigators opened it, found nothing, and moved on, never realizing the child could have been inside earlier. Without a body, an appliance is just an object. But if Jose's memory is right, That object once held a child's laughter, and possibly her last breath. In forensic reconstruction, every item in a scene has to be accounted for. You can't explain a disappearance if parts of the environment vanish with it. A door added, a couch moved, a fridge gone, each change erases a layer of truth. In the Wells case, those erasures form a pattern too precise to ignore. What remains is the simplest, most painful hypothesis, that Summer's favorite hiding place became her final one, and that the adults around her chose to erase it rather than face what it meant. If that's true, it doesn't make them monsters. It makes them cowards, people who loved a child but feared accountability more than grief. And so the question persists, heavier than any door: where is that refrigerator now? Who decided it didn't matter? Why was it never documented? Because until those questions are answered, the official story remains incomplete. Every missing case depends on the objects left behind, the locks, the couches, the things that don't move unless someone moves them. In this one, an old fridge stood silent beside a camper, long enough for a little girl to hide and laugh inside it. Then it was gone. Maybe the only thing that ever needed to be found was already sitting in plain sight. Every night, sometime after 5, the same pattern repeated. Candace would pour herself a drink, step outside or into the kitchen where the signal was strongest, and call Dawn. Jose remembers it vividly. The routine never changed. The phone rang from her side, not his. It was always Candace who reached out. And every time, it ended the same way: raised voices, swearing, and then silence. The public version of the Wells marriage often painted Dawn as the distant husband, the man working out of state, the provider, the one sending money home to keep the lights on. But Jose's description flips that narrative completely. Dawn wasn't absent, he was omnipresent. He didn't need to be in Tennessee to control what happened there. He did it through those nightly calls. The pattern was mechanical. Candace called to ask for money, for gas, groceries, cigarettes, sometimes to buy food for the kids. Dawn answered, sometimes calm, sometimes angry, depending on how much he had been drinking. The conversation escalated within minutes. He accused her of wasting money. She accused him of not caring. Then came the threats. Dawn saying he'd pull the kids out and bring them to Utah. Candace saying he'd never see them again. And when the call ended, she would sit in silence, drink, and start again the next night. Jose was downstairs in the basement most evenings, trying to block out the noise, but the walls of that house didn't keep secrets. He could hear every word. He told Chris McDonough, they fought like that almost every night. It was always about money and him wanting to move everyone out there. The way he described it, those arguments weren't occasional marital spats, they were the pulse of the house. Everything revolved around Dawn's approval, even from 1,000 miles away. That's the first important fact. Candace wasn't running the household. She was surviving inside one managed remotely by a man who weaponized money. Financial control is a classic hallmark of coercive. Dawn dictated what she could spend, when she could leave, even who she could see. Jose said that Candace often avoided answering calls from friends, because Dawn would accuse her of cheating or wasting time. He didn't need cameras or visits to maintain dominance. The phone line was enough. That dynamic had another consequence. It normalized constant conflict. When a child grows up in a home where shouting is the background noise, silence becomes the alarm. Jose said Summer was used to it. She would keep playing even while her parents fought on speakerphone. The boys, meanwhile, retreated to their rooms. It was chaos every night, he said. Nobody relaxed until she hung up. This chaos matters because of its timing. The calls usually began around dusk, between 5 and 6 in the evening, precisely the same window that would later define the timeline of Summer's disappearance. That's not coincidence, it's pattern. By that hour, Candace was often drinking, Dawn was angry, and the house was in emotional freefall. Every night carried the same ingredients for disaster: noise, neglect, distraction. When investigators reconstructed June 15, they noted that the call between Dawn and Candace that evening was unusually tense. Dawn himself later said he got a bad feeling during the conversation, claiming Candace sounded out of it. To him, it was just another argument. To anyone who's lived through domestic cycles like that, It was a familiar breaking point, the moment when old patterns finally snap. Jose's recollection makes that call even more significant. It wasn't an isolated fight, it was the continuation of months of remote control, exhaustion, and emotional dependence. He described Candace as someone, always waiting for him to send something. That dependency stripped her of agency. The longer Dawn stayed away, the more she relied on those nightly conversations to feel connected, even if the connection was toxic. That kind of dynamic leaves a mark. Psychologists call it intermittent reinforcement. The abuser alternates cruelty and affection, keeping the victim perpetually off balance. When Dawn wasn't yelling, he would promise big plans, a new start in Utah, a better house, maybe a job for Candace. Those promises reset the cycle. She believed him long enough to endure the next wave of insults. Over time, the arguments blurred into background noise, except for Jose, who saw the cumulative damage. "You could tell she was cracking," he said. After she got off the phone, she'd drink more. Then she'd get quiet, like she was somewhere else. That, somewhere else, was where neglect begins. When adults are locked in emotional combat, children disappear from the center of attention. They become collateral. And in the Wells household, the line between distraction and danger was thin. It's easy to imagine the evening Summer vanished, fitting perfectly into that loop. A phone call after 5, voices rising. One parent desperate, one furious. A momentary lapse in supervision. A door left open, a child unsupervised, seconds of opportunity. Dawn's insistence on moving the family to Utah added another layer of instability. According to Jose, he talked about it constantly, using it as leverage. When Candace resisted, he'd accuse her of being lazy or ungrateful. To her, Utah represented exile, isolation in a state where she'd have no support system, no family. To Dawn, it was control in its purest form. The more he threatened to relocate the kids, the more desperate she became to appease him. That desperation explains her later contradictions during interviews. Candace oscillated between grief and defensiveness, guilt and deflection. The psychological residue of years spent being emotionally cornered. In that environment, truth isn't told, it's negotiated. For law enforcement, these nightly calls should have been treated as evidence of motive, not just background noise. They expose a relationship stretched to breaking, one where financial pressure and emotional volatility defined every evening. They show that by the time Summer disappeared, the Wells family wasn't living through a single crisis, but the end of a long chain of them. In domestic violence analysis, repetition is key. One argument means tension. 100 arguments mean pattern. And pattern means predictability. When investigators see consistent emotional escalation tied to a specific time, in this case, early evening, it narrows the window for critical incidents. That's exactly the time frame when Summer was last seen. What Jose provided, perhaps without realizing it, was a behavioral map of decay. Each call was a small detonation, resetting the countdown toward catastrophe. After those fights, Jose said the atmosphere in the house changed. Candace would sometimes storm out to her mother's camper, leaving the kids alone. Other times she'd sit outside muttering, waiting for Dawn to call again. The boys learned not to interrupt. Summer, too young to understand, would climb into her mother's lap, seeking comfort from someone who no longer had any to give. If you zoom out, those nightly calls weren't just arguments, they were the architecture of dysfunction. The phone line was an umbilical cord that fed control one direction and despair the other. By the time June 15 arrived, that system was collapsing under its own weight. One more fight, one more evening where attention drifted, and something irreversible happened. Whether Summer wandered off, suffered an accident, or met a worse fate, the context around her disappearance was already scripted: distraction, tension, dependency, noise. The phone didn't cause what happened, but it set the rhythm that made it possible. In a way, those calls are still echoing. You can hear them in every contradiction, every defensive statement, every desperate attempt to sound composed on camera. The tone never changed: accusation, justification, silence. The Wells home didn't fall apart the night Summer disappeared. It was crumbling one phone call at a time. Jose Roman has replayed that moment in his head for years. He was walking down the narrow hallway toward the bathroom, looking for a towel. when he heard the sound of running water and a small voice, Summer's voice. She was laughing, high-pitched, carefree. But then he heard another sound beneath it, a man's voice, low and casual, talking to her through the noise of the shower. When he stepped closer, he realized it was Dawn. He pushed the door open a few inches and froze. Summer was in the bathtub. Dawn was there with her. Neither of them noticed him right away. He said he remembered standing there for a few seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. It wasn't playful splashing. It was a grown man bathing with his 4-year-old daughter, and not in a home where there weren't other options. There was no emergency, no excuse. It just didn't look right, Josie said. She was naked, he was naked. I told him, "You shouldn't be doing that." He reached in, grabbed a towel, and lifted Summer out. Dawn reacted instantly. "What's your problem?" he barked. His voice turned sharp, defensive, full of anger that felt disproportionate. Candace was nearby, within earshot, but she didn't intervene. She didn't say a word. Jose told her later that it wasn't normal, that she needed to bathe her daughter herself. Candace just shrugged. "It's fine," she said. "He's her dad." That response still haunts him. In isolation, the incident could be brushed off as cultural difference or ignorance, a poor family's misguided version of caretaking. But in context, it fit a pattern of blurred boundaries and passive neglect that Jose had already witnessed in that house. Nothing had limits, not the drinking, not the shouting, not even privacy. The children roamed freely, adults argued openly, and respect for space simply didn't exist. But this, a father showering naked with his daughter, was different. This crossed the line between dysfunction and danger. Psychologists and forensic experts recognize this behavior as a red flag for grooming, not necessarily proof of assault, but an erosion of personal boundaries that often precedes it. A child learns to see nudity, touch, and secrecy as normal. A parent learns that no one in the environment will challenge them. It's a quiet rehearsal for later harm. Jose might not have known the terminology, but he understood the instinct. It wasn't right. He told investigators, "I felt sick about it." He said he wanted to confront Dawn but was afraid of starting a fight. Dawn had a temper, and Jose had seen him explode before. Instead, he wrapped Summer in a towel, walked her to Candace, and told her to handle it. Candace didn't. That silence is its own form of complicity. When a non-offending parent witnesses inappropriate behavior and says nothing, they create an ecosystem of permission. The child stops expecting protection. Over time, the entire family dynamic rearranges around that unspoken rule: look away, stay quiet, pretend it's normal. For Jose, the weight of that moment never lifted. In later interviews, his voice cracked when he said, "I should have called the cops. I should have done something." He knew he had seen something that could have mattered, something that might have changed what came next. But at the time, he was just another adult living in chaos, overwhelmed and afraid of confrontation. "If I had told someone," he said, "maybe that little girl would still be here." That sentence, equal parts guilt and regret, reveals how much he understood after the fact. In missing child investigations, unreported discomfort often marks the earliest warning sign that everyone ignored. It's the kind of detail that, years later, investigators find in hindsight and realize was the pivot point, the last time someone could have intervened, before the story turned tragic. When this revelation surfaced in the interview with Chris McDonough, viewers were stunned. But what made it more chilling was that Don himself had already confirmed it publicly, though in a disturbingly casual tone. In an earlier YouTube appearance, Don had said, "I bathe my daughter sometimes. People make it sound bad, but it's not." That line, "I bathe my daughter sometimes," is one of the most revealing sentences he ever spoke. No one accused him before he said it. He volunteered it, as if anticipating suspicion. That's not the instinct of an innocent man. That's the instinct of someone trying to preempt judgment. It's a classic psychological tactic. Confess just enough to normalize what others would find alarming. The public reaction to Don's statement was split. Some viewers argued that in rural or poor households, shared bathing wasn't unusual. Others pointed out that the child's age and the father's behavior removed any innocence from the act. Context is everything, And the Wells home context was one already steeped in dysfunction, secrecy, and fear. In that light, Doan's innocent explanation only deepened the unease. For investigators, Jose's account provides something no one else ever has, a first-hand observation of boundary violation. It's not speculation or hearsay. It's eyewitness evidence of an act that, while not criminal on its own, drastically reframes Dawn's psychology and Candace's compliance. It shows a father unafraid of exposure and a mother conditioned to submission. It exposes a family system where what's fine might actually mean what can't be changed. What investigators failed to do then, the audience can see now that the shower incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the moment that defined the power structure inside that house. Doan's authority was total, Candace's compliance absolute, and Summer's boundaries non-existent. In such an environment, accountability is impossible. Even without direct evidence of imposition, the psychological landscape is clear. Candace's silence during the confrontation wasn't just fear of Dawn, it was resignation. It was the learned helplessness of someone who has stopped distinguishing between what's right and what's survivable. And for a child like Summer, growing up amid that confusion, danger didn't look like danger anymore. It looked like routine. In retrospect, that one scene in the bathroom encapsulates everything wrong about the Wells home. Dunn's later insistence that people misunderstand. Those moments only underscores how normalized the behavior had become for him. In his mind, being accused of impropriety was more offensive than the act itself. No one knows what truly happened to Summer after that day. But everyone who studies the case recognizes this. Jose's account of the shower is the only verifiable instance of direct, inappropriate contact between Don Wells and his daughter. It is the line that connects every later suspicion of control, secrecy, and guilt. It's the moment the case stopped being about a missing child and started being about the world she lived in. A father's defensiveness, a mother's silence, a witness's regret. 3 people, 1 bathroom, and the last undeniable sign that something inside that house was deeply, dangerously wrong. Between October 2020 and June 2021, the Wells property changed, not because of renovation, but because of erasure. Jose Roman left that house in the fall of 2020. He could prove it with a paper trail, the last bank transaction he made in Tennessee, the date on the bus ticket he used to leave. 8 months later, Summer Wells vanished. In those 8 months, everything inside that house looked different. When investigators compared early photos from the time Jose lived there with footage recorded after Summer's disappearance, the contrasts were striking. A new bunk bed appeared in the boys' room. A partial wall had been built to divide the open space. The basement, once a cluttered, accessible area, now had a solid deadbolt on the door. What had once been described as chaotic but harmless home now looked staged, compartmentalized, and fortified. To the casual observer, those might seem like harmless updates, a family improving their living conditions. But to anyone who understands behavioral forensics, the timing matters more than the aesthetics. People who clean, build, or rearrange after a crisis often aren't improving, they're rewriting. When Jose was there, the house's structure mirrored the family itself, open, messy, exposed. You could see from the kitchen into the living room, from the stairs down into the basement. There were no true barriers, no privacy, no locks. By the time the FBI entered that same space in June 2021, it had become a maze of partitions and closures. Every visible change aligned with an invisible motive, to control a narrative that was already falling apart. The most significant shift coincided with Don Wells' return from Utah. When he came back, according to neighbors, the noise began again, hammering, sawing, late-night repairs. He told others he was fixing up the place. But Jose's earlier descriptions suggest something else. None of those modifications were necessary until the story of Summer's disappearance required them to be. This is the essence of retrospective staging, the psychological urge to reconfigure a space to make it match the version of events being told publicly. In legal terms, it's contamination of a scene. In human terms, it's guilt wearing the mask of maintenance. The new bunk bed, for instance, had symbolic weight. During Jose's stay, the kids slept in scattered arrangements, mattresses on the floor, blankets in the basement. The introduction of a neat bunk bed months later turned disarray into a photograph of domestic order. To outsiders, it signaled normal family life. To investigators, it signaled reconstruction. Even the new wall dividing the living area served a subtle function. It hid sightlines. It created corners where once there were none. Corners are convenient when you want to control what others can see. The Wells home, which had once been brutally transparent, became strategically opaque. The deadbolt on the basement door was the final touch, not a renovation, but a declaration. The lock existed to prove something, not to prevent something. Don had to make the physical environment align with the story he told the police, that Summer couldn't have left on her own. A locked door becomes a silent witness in court. It says what its owner cannot. We did everything right. But Jose's departure marked more than a change in furniture and fixtures. It marked the moment accountability left the building. While he was there was an outside adult, someone with perspective, someone who noticed. When he left, the only witnesses to daily life were those already invested in hiding it. What followed was 8 months of quiet reconstruction, not just of walls, but of memory. Neighbors later described the period between late 2020 and mid-2021 as unusually private. The Wells family withdrew. Fewer visitors came by. Even relatives said contact was minimal. On social media, Candace shared almost nothing. Don, meanwhile, resurfaced online only when the disappearance went public. It was as if the family had gone underground, building not just new walls in their home, but a narrative bunker. And in that bunker, denial hardened into routine. This is where the pattern of normalization fully took root. The Wells family had always minimized their problems, but during those missing months, minimization became survival. Every external criticism was met with an internal justification. The house wasn't dirty, they were just poor. Don wasn't aggressive, he was misunderstood. Candace wasn't neglectful, she was overwhelmed. Summer wasn't unsupervised, she was independent. Each excuse insulated them from change, allowing dysfunction to feel ordinary. It's a phenomenon psychologists call the normalization of deviance, the gradual acceptance of behavior that once seemed unacceptable until it becomes invisible. Over time, boundaries blur, accountability fades, and the family redefines normal to include the very things that endanger them. That process was evident in every decision they made during those 8 months. When Candace saw Summer climbing into the old refrigerator, she said, "She's fine." When Don shouted or drank, she said, "He'll change." When outsiders questioned their living conditions, they said, "We're poor, not bad parents." Each justification seems small in isolation. Together, they form the scaffolding of a worldview where responsibility no longer exists. That's why the 8-month gap is more than just a temporal void. It's the psychological furnace in which their version of reality was forged. By the time Summer disappeared, denial wasn't a reaction, it was reflex. When the truth finally demanded attention, they responded with the only tool they had left: more denial, more construction, more control. They added locks, they built walls. They rearranged the environment to hide what had already gone wrong. The tragedy of this period is that it likely erased the last physical traces of whatever happened to Summer. If an accident occurred, the signs would have been subtle: stains, disturbed flooring, misplaced objects. But by the time investigators entered, those signs were gone, buried under new paint and wood. The Wells family had built over the past, literally. And yet, even as they tried to fix the house, they couldn't fix the story. The lies had their own architecture, and like the house, it began to collapse under scrutiny. Every provement invited new questions. Every denial drew attention to what was missing. When Don said, "We've cleaned everything," investigators heard a confession disguised as pride. The 8-month gap between Jose's departure and Summer's disappearance is the silence between two versions of the same house, one unguarded, one staged. In the first, a child could wander freely. In the second, that possibility had to be erased. The transformation wasn't aesthetic, it was defensive. The Wells didn't renovate their home to make it livable. They renovated it to make it believable. But in doing so, they created their own contradiction, a house too perfect to match the chaos everyone had once seen, a timeline too neat to match human behavior. That's the real meaning of the missing months. They weren't spent searching for stability. They were spent constructing a story solid enough to withstand investigation. The problem is, no amount of lumber or locks can cover the cracks left by truth. The moment you start building to hide, you've already confessed that something needs hiding. In those 8 months, the Wells family turned their home into a monument of denial, every wall a defense, every lock a lie. By the time the world came looking for Summer Wells, the house was ready to speak. And what it said, without words, was simple. This is not the same place she disappeared from. It's the version they want you to see. From the beginning, the Wells family insisted on one thing: a stranger took their daughter. They painted a picture of an intruder creeping up the steep hill, slipping past the trees, the dogs, the neighbors, entering a locked home unseen, and vanishing again with a child in seconds. It sounded cinematic, almost comforting in its distance. Because if a stranger did it, the guilt stayed outside. But anyone who has ever stood on Ben Hill Road knows that story collapses the moment you see the terrain. The property sits on an exposed rise, no fence, no cover, only open slope. You can't walk 50 feet without triggering a chorus of barking. Jose Roman laughed bitterly when asked if someone could have snuck up there. "Those dogs would have killed a stranger," he said. 5 or 6 of them, loud, mean, protective. You can't even drive up the hill without them surrounding the car. Chris McDonough, who visited the site himself, agreed. You'd hear those dogs before you saw the porch. He pointed out the practical impossibility. An abductor would have had to climb a dirt incline, avoid the noise, bypass vehicles parked outside, open an unlocked door, grab a child, and leave, all in a window of minutes, without a single sound or witness. It doesn't happen like that, he said. Not here. The geography is its own alibi. A stranger would need an escape route, a second vehicle, a back road, something unseen. But Ben Hill has none. One way in, one way out. Every car that approaches can be heard from half a mile away. There are no tire marks, no footprints, no broken brush. No one saw lights on the road that night, no engines, no shadows. The official searches confirmed as much. Tracking dogs never caught a foreign scent. The cadaver teams found nothing. There was no evidence of a chase, no signs of struggle, no discarded clothing, no trail leading away from the house. Even the FBI's behavioral unit quietly noted that the scenario of an outside abduction in such an isolated location defies environmental likelihood. In simpler terms, it doesn't add up. So why hold on to it? Because for Dawn and Candace, the stranger theory wasn't just a possibility, it was a shield. It redirected everything outward: public anger, police suspicion, their own shame. The moment they said, "She was taken," the narrative shifted from negligence to victimhood. They became the grieving parents, not the responsible ones. And once that frame was set, every inconsistency, the unlocked doors, the silence, the timeline gaps, could be dismissed as trauma, not deception. But Jose's testimony stripped that cover away. He lived there. He knew those dogs, heard them every time a car drove by, watched them swarm the driveway. He knew the visibility of the hill, how voices carried through the trees. If anyone came up there, the whole holler would have heard it, he said. You'd have to be invisible. In missing person investigations, invisible strangers usually mean something else entirely, someone familiar, someone already inside the circle. Most child abductions that appear random turn out to be relational: a family member, a friend, a neighbor, someone who knows the layout, the schedule, the shortcuts, someone who doesn't trigger alarms. The Wells house fits that pattern exactly. Even Don's own interviews betrayed how much he depended on the stranger theory. Every time he spoke to media, he emphasized abduction, while simultaneously undercutting it. I don't know why they'd take her, he said. Maybe to sell her, maybe to hurt us. Then, minutes later, he'd contradict himself. Nobody could have got past those dogs. That contradiction isn't confusion. It's self-preservation colliding with reality. The abduction narrative also served another purpose. It kept the public searching in the wrong direction. Hundreds of volunteers combed the woods, drained ponds, and scanned rivers while the core of the mystery, the house itself, remained insulated by sympathy. As long as the Wells family appeared to be victims of a monstrous outsider, few dared to question whether the monster might have lived under the same roof. By late 2022, even veteran investigators quietly admitted what many online researchers already believed: the stranger didn't exist. There was no car, no footprint, no trace of intrusion. The only consistent presence in the evidence was the family itself. The myth of the intruder survived for one reason: it was useful. It gave the parents language when silence would have condemned them. It gave the community a villain to imagine. And it gave the case longevity in headlines that prefer a mystery over a tragedy of neglect. But every myth eventually collapses under the weight of fact. The dogs, the slope, the missing tire tracks, they all tell the same story. No one came for Summer Wells. No stranger climbed that hill. The danger didn't arrive from outside. It was already home. When Jose Roman decided to speak publicly about what he had seen inside the Wells home, he thought he was helping a missing child. He didn't expect that within days, his own name would become the next target. What began as one interview turned into an avalanche of hatred. Strangers online called him a liar, a drunk, a criminal. Then came the word that destroyed everything: RSO. It wasn't true. There was no record, no charge, no conviction. But in the echo chamber of social media, truth doesn't matter. One person posted the accusation, another repeated it, and by the end of the week, YouTube comment sections and Facebook groups were filled with messages branding him a predator. It spread faster than any fact he'd shared about the Wells family. Jose lost his job within a month. The rumor followed him to every interview, every phone call. "I couldn't even get hired to sweep a floor," he said. He eventually lost his apartment too, moving between shelters and friends' couches, dragging a backpack that now held his entire life. He went from witness to pariah, punished not for lying, but for telling the truth about people who still had a home, a voice, and a camera in front of them. That's how social execution works. It's not about disproving a statement, it's about destroying the person who made it. The goal isn't justice, it's silence. In true crime culture, that silence is often disguised as skepticism. Viewers say they're just asking questions, but what they're really doing is dismantling credibility one rumor at a time until no one dares to speak again. Jose's story is a case study in that mechanism. The Wells family, shielded by public sympathy, never had to discredit his testimony directly. The internet did it for them. YouTube channels that once amplified his interview later turned on him, claiming his past made him unreliable. Commenters scoured arrest databases looking for anything with his name on it. They found unrelated records, a minor citation, a decades-old misdemeanor, and twisted them into proof of guilt. The irony is that Jose's only crime was proximity. He had lived inside a place where the truth was toxic, and when he carried that truth out into the world, it poisoned him instead. The same audience that demanded answers about Summer Wells devoured the man who tried to provide them. This is the dark side of the true crime community, what sociologists now call vigilante sensationalism. It's the point where collective curiosity mutates into collective cruelty. Every viewer becomes a detective, every rumor a clue, every mistake an indictment. The algorithms reward outrage, not accuracy, so lies spread further than facts ever could. When Chris McDonough first brought Jose onto his channel, he expected controversy but not character assassination. Even he later admitted that Jose paid a heavy price for speaking out. The viewers who once praised him for his honesty turned on him the moment he said something that challenged their favorite theory. That's the other rule of social execution. The moment your truth threatens the story people want to believe, you become the new villain. For Jose, the damage wasn't just digital. The constant harassment pushed him into isolation. He stopped answering calls, deleted social media, and disappeared for months. "I thought about ending it," he confessed later. "I just wanted it to stop." He had entered the case as a witness to dysfunction. He left it as a casualty of public obsession. The Wells family lost a child. Jose lost his identity. Both disappeared in their own way. What makes his situation more tragic is that it mirrors the same pattern that destroyed the Wells household: denial, deflection, and collective blindness. The same forces that erased Summer's truth, fear, pride, silence, reappeared online in a new form. The public, too, preferred a clean narrative over a complicated reality. And when the truth came from someone messy, someone human, they tore him apart to protect their illusion. José's fall exposes a grim reality about modern investigations. In the digital age, evidence competes with entertainment. The louder a voice gets, the less people care whether it's right. Real witnesses don't stand a chance. In that sense, José became the second victim of the Summer Wells case, not because of what happened inside that house, but because of what happened after he left it. His story is a warning that truth, when it's inconvenient, costs more than silence. He once said, "I told them everything I saw, and for that, I lost everything I had." And that may be the most accurate summary of this entire case, a truth that, in the end, destroyed everyone who dared to speak it. When you lay all the pieces side by side, the story stops being a mystery and starts to look like a chain reaction, one mistake igniting the next, until the entire truth was buried under panic. The open basement door created opportunity. The discarded refrigerator created risk. The shower incident revealed blurred boundaries. The nightly calls exposed chaos. And the family's fear of child protective services gave them motive. Every fragment points in the same direction. The danger wasn't a stranger, a kidnapper, or a random act. It was an environment that had been collapsing for years, and on one ordinary afternoon, it finally broke. Summer Wells likely died inside that house, not because of malice, but because no one around her was sober, alert, or brave enough to stop a tragedy from happening. The most plausible scenario, when stripped of speculation and theatrics, is painfully simple. Summer wandered into danger, possibly the old refrigerator, possibly another enclosed space, while her mother was distracted. When Candace found her, it was too late. There were no screams, no witnesses, just silence. The silence that terrified her wasn't the loss itself, it was what it meant. Another child dead in her care, another investigation, another call to CPS. In that split second, self-preservation took over. She called no one. She didn't cry for help. She reached for Don. And Don, returning from Utah, did what he had always done. He took control, not of the situation, but of the story. The pattern that followed fits classic post-crisis staging: remove or hide the triggering object, alter the physical layout, rewrite the timeline. The lock installed on the basement door, the missing refrigerator, the new wall and bunk beds, the cleaned floors. None of it was random. It was the creation of an alternate version of reality where Summer never could have left, never could have reached danger, and therefore must have been taken by someone else. From that point on, every action they took was to preserve the myth. Dawn gave interviews insisting the house was secure. Candace repeated the same line. She never wandered off, with the mechanical precision of a person repeating her own defense. The community joined the search for a phantom abductor while the real story hid in plain sight. Even José's memory of the family dynamic supports this sequence. A household full of arguments, alcohol, and denial doesn't suddenly produce a calculated murder. It produces accidents, and the desperate lies that follow them. When you live in chaos long enough, lying becomes instinct. It's not just a way to deceive others, it's how you survive yourself. The Wells home was the perfect incubator for that instinct. Every boundary was already broken. Dawn blurred fatherhood with control. Candace blurred neglect with normalcy. José's regret, "I should have called the cops," marks the only moment anyone recognized the danger for what it was. No one else ever did. When investigators arrived, they didn't find a crime scene because there wasn't one left to find. The house had been cleaned, rearranged, sanitized into the story it needed to tell. Even the deadbolt gleamed like a signature on a rewritten confession. See, we kept her safe. But physical reconstruction can't erase behavioral truth. Every contradiction, the missing fridge, the newly locked door, the dogs that would have exposed an intruder who never existed, leads back to the same unavoidable conclusion: there was no outsider. The threat, the accident, and the cover-up were all homegrown. The psychological motive is as clear as the physical one. Dawn and Candace were already under scrutiny from CPS. Losing another child meant losing everything. In that moment, Guilt didn't look like guilt, it looked like survival. They didn't need to plan a cover-up. It happened naturally, as reflex. Clean. Hide. Denny, that's why this case feels unfinished. Because the truth isn't hidden in the woods. It's trapped inside a version of events the Wells family has spent years defending. Every new interview, every public plea, every revision of the timeline is another coat of paint over the same decaying structure. The public still debates abduction versus foul play, innocence versus guilt, but the evidence, the physical, behavioral, and psychological, only supports one narrative, a preventable death, followed by fear, followed by a cover story that consumed everyone who touched it. No abductor, no witness, only a house full of lies. And in all the years since, despite the searches, the interviews, the speculation, no one has ever proven that Summer Wells left that house alive.